Hi, this is Vivian from PharmaSalon. Before you watch, I want to let you know that if you're interested in getting a CE credit for this video, go to the show notes below. There's a link to the Compounding CE website that will take you directly to the quiz for this class. The show notes also include the questions on the quiz, so be sure to check them out. While you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel.
Hello and welcome to the Designing a Testing Program lesson. My name is Stephanie Chacon and I am the Quality Director at Empower Pharmacy, and I'm very happy to be here today with you presenting on this topic. Let's dive right in. I do not have a conflict of interest. Let's review our objectives. At the end of this lesson, you'll be able to justify why different types of testing are best performed by a third party and not in-house. You'll be able to evaluate your current compounding data to determine which formulas should be included in your testing program. And if you get out of specification potency results, you will be able to perform a basic investigation. The first thing we need to do is define testing. Now, there's lots of testing that could occur in a compounding pharmacy. This is by no means an all-inclusive list. There might be some testing that you do that's not listed here. But for the purposes of this presentation, I wanted to make sure that it didn't get too complicated. So these are the main types of testing that I was thinking about when I wrote this. Our first section here is preparation testing. On the non-sterile side, these are some common tests that might be performed. Potency, pH, water activity, that's a big one for BUDs, microbiological, or weight and uniformity. On the sterile side, you're going to be doing sterility and endotoxin. You might also do particulate matter and potentially potency and pH. Our next section is our personnel testing. You've got your competency assessments. These are generally written tests. Those could be on USP chapters or maybe your SOPs. You've got observations. This is where the technician is visually observed to make sure they are performing the process correctly. You've got media fills and glove fingertip testing if you perform sterile compounding. Our next section is environmental testing. This is big on the sterile side. We've got viable air and surface sampling, non-viable air and surface sampling, which would be particle counts, pressurization or smoke studies. In HD, we also have pressurization since it's incredibly important to maintain negative pressure in the HD space. You probably also do HD wipe sampling, or maybe you even just use a black light to assess potential contamination. And last up, we have our equipment testing. A big one here is going to be clean room certification. Also, the certification of your primary engineering controls, so all of your powder containment hoods. And then your calibration. You probably have annual balance calibration in addition to daily calibration. You might also have some other instruments that need calibration, just depending on how you have things set up in your pharmacy. Now that we've got a good idea of what testing we're thinking about, we need to look at in-house versus third-party testing. The in-house testing is performed in the pharmacy by pharmacy personnel. If you're doing this, you want to make sure that the personnel performing the in-house testing are qualified to do so. So do your training records provide evidence of this qualification? Go ahead and look at that. Make sure that they do. Make sure there's objective evidence that says this personnel is able to perform this in-house testing. Your equipment, if you have testing equipment, needs to be calibrated itself. So for example, if you do your own viable air sampling in your clean room and you have an air sampler, that needs to be calibrated on a regular basis. Are you calibrating that equipment? The answer should be yes if you're going to use those results. Also be thinking about, do you have an SOP for that? If you're doing in-house testing, you need to have that process in an SOP documented. Third-party testing, that's the testing performed by a qualified vendor. Some things I want you to think about there are, how do you choose your testing vendor and how are they qualified? If you don't have a vendor qualification program, I would highly suggest that you do it, even if it's a simplified version, just so you have something to say, we vetted that this third party, it has good quality and has good processes in place. You also want to look at your contract or service agreement or quality agreement if you have one. These are especially important when you're doing preparation testing. That way you can have some sort of process set up with that third party for what happens when there's an out of specification result. How do they notify you? What's the time frame for notification? And will they provide you with a copy of their investigation should they obtain an OOS result?
All right, Stephanie, thanks. What would be the benefits of bringing some testing in-house, like endotoxin testing, for example?
Well, bringing testing in-house is going to potentially reduce the turnaround time. So like you mentioned, endotoxin testing, if you're doing that in-house, you could potentially get that done, say, within 24 hours from when you make the preparation. Whereas if you send it out, you have the time that it takes for it to be shipped to the lab, and then the time it takes for the lab to put it in their queue, perform the testing, and then report the results back to you. So, it is possible that it's going to help shorten that turnaround time, but then you have to kind of consider, what's the cost to bring it in-house versus the cost to send it out for testing. So there's several variables that you want to consider.
Okay, thanks. Can you expand more on why in-house sterility testing could be a challenge?
Yeah, so there's equipment that you can buy to perform in-house sterility testing. I am not an expert on that, by the way, but it does exist. The problem with that is, in order to have a valid sterility test, one of the things you need to do is method suitability. And that's where you need to inoculate your sample with 5 or 6 different organisms, and that's bacteria and fungi. So you have to bring those organisms into your space, and you could potentially end up contaminating your workspace, your lab, or potentially other preparations if you're not handling all of that stuff properly. So ideally, you would want to create a space specifically for that. And you just have to find out, do you have the resources to have a completely separate space for in-house sterility testing, to train someone appropriately to do that, to perform a valid USP 71 sterility test, to validate your methods. There's a work and resource goes into it. So from my perspective, I think that it's just easier and ultimately costs less to send it out to a lab. But if you're a bigger pharmacy or maybe a 503B outsourcing facility, you might be able to bring that in-house.
Okay, great, thanks. What are the most important things to do or to remember when deciding to perform testing in-house?
When you're bringing testing in-house, or any type of testing that you're performing in-house, whether it's preparation testing or equipment or even people, you want to make sure you have your processes and your procedures written for that. So, many years ago, I had a microbiologist on my team, and he would do our viable air sampling. So we had a volumetric air sampler that was used to take in a certain volume of air for viable samples. And I never thought about it. We had SOPs for our powder hoods, our balances, our pH meters, everything. And we were going through an inspection, and the inspector says, "Oh, well, where's your SOP for this volumetric air sampler?" We just didn't have one. He knew what he was doing, and it just never crossed my mind that we needed to write an SOP for that. So it was a gap. We corrected it, but look at all the testing you're doing and just check your procedures and make sure that you have that written up. Because of course, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. You can't train someone on that. So I had no proof that he knew how to use the equipment or that he was using it correctly, even though he was, because if it's not written, it didn't happen. So we had to write that SOP, document that training, and have that all in place. So whatever testing you're doing, just double check your SOPs and make sure you're covered.
So I have a question then. I'm going to put that in the live and learn category, right?
Yep.
So how many times have you encountered that? Because you say write the SOPs, but clearly it wasn't due to neglect. It was just sort of it was a lack of experience. And by that, I don't mean that you were inexperienced, because we all at some point, encounter something that we're like, oh, I never even thought about that. How often would you say that happens? And like, what would you say you could do, I guess, to mitigate? Is there anything you can do to mitigate those experience or lack of anything you could do to mitigate that?
Yeah, I think when you're relying on subject matter experts, like I said, I had that microbiologist, he's an expert on microbiology. I'm not. I know a little bit, I know enough to get by. And I just took for granted, oh, he knows how to do this. He's been doing it for a while. No big deal. We're all good. And so it didn't cross my mind that we should have a procedure for this. And one of the best things you can do to mitigate that is just perform internal audits. Audit yourself. Go through all of your equipment that you have and just reference that against your SOPs. Do you have an SOP for each piece of equipment? Is it up to date? Are you calibrating your equipment on time? Is that in your procedure? So really doing internal audits, self-audits is going to be the best way to find those gaps that you don't even think about when you're just consciously going about your day.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Now, it is my recommendation that you limit the testing that you do in-house. For preparation testing, most commonly in process, you're going to test pH. If you need to adjust the pH, you're going to test it right then and there as you're making that formulation and adjust it and test it. That is totally fine. You have to do that. Make sure that your pH meter is calibrated and your technicians have signed off that they have trained on and can use that equipment properly. You probably also do weight assessments. I think what comes to mind most often with that is weighing your capsules at the end of a batch to make sure they've been filled in a uniform way, And you could potentially do endotoxin testing in-house. There are some great machines out there that make this pretty easy. If you do that, make sure that your technicians are trained and that they have been qualified to use that equipment and that you have validated your preparations on that equipment. This one's on here for me as a maybe because you really want to weigh the pros and the cons here. Is it worth the training, the time, the cost, or is it really just going to be better for you to send that out to a third party? If you're already sending out your sterility testing, probably makes more sense to also have the third party perform that endotoxin testing. For personnel, you can do your observations and your competency assessments in-house. That's no problem, but potency really needs to be sent out to a third party. It's incredibly difficult to do in-house potency testing. It's not impossible, but it's going to cost a lot and it's going to take a lot of time. So that's probably not something that you're going to do in-house. For your environmental monitoring, a lot of this you can definitely do in-house if you have the equipment and the space. You could do your viable air and surface sampling, particulate matter. You can even do your own smoke studies. If you do that, just make sure that you're recording them. My recommendation would be that a third party performs these tests on a semi-annual basis, and then maybe you do your own testing at some other predefined interval. So maybe you want to do viable air and surface sampling monthly. If that's what you want to do that in-house. Again, just make sure you've got SOPs for how to use that equipment, how to perform those tests, and then how to evaluate the results. So you're going to want to make sure that you have those written and that they are very robust so that mistakes will not be made. And then equipment, this is pretty much always going to be done by a third party unless you are a large enough pharmacy to have your own maybe facilities and engineering department that could do it for you. But most often this is going to be done by a third party. Some things to consider when you're trying to decide if it's something that you should do in-house or send out is to think about the cost, is to think about the qualification. So are your staff capable of performing that test? Resources. Do you have the people to dedicate to that? Compounding pharmacies are always very busy, and it might just be easier and honestly faster for you to send that out instead of trying to dedicate someone who's already stretched really thin to performing the testing in-house. And then last, there is potentially a bias or conflict of interest if you're performing your own testing all the time, unless you have like I said, specific departments that are completely separate from operations that are able to do that in an objective way. So just be thinking about those things. For the most part, that analytical testing is going to be sent to a third party and not performed in-house. Now, you might be wondering, why exactly do I need to create a formal in-house testing program? You're busy. I mentioned it earlier. Compounding pharmacies are always busy. The formal testing program is going to help keep everyone on track, and it will ensure that the required testing is completed and that the results are analyzed. It's going to give you a bird's eye view of all the testing that needs to occur for the year, and that's going to help with budgeting and resource allocation. It's also going to help ensure that you have that raw objective data. Regulatory inspections really come down to what you can prove and what you can defend. This data can show that your operations are in a state of control or potentially not, which if you're not in a state of control, you absolutely want to know that so you can get it corrected. Now, how do you create this testing program? The first thing you want to do is decide what needs to be tested and how often. You're going to create your master schedule based on those answers. You're going to follow it, and then you're going to respond to out of specification results. So sometimes it's really easy to get caught up in, oh, I'm doing all this testing, but if those results are not reviewed, and if those out of specification results are not addressed and corrected, that's 50% of the program that's missing. So make sure you're doing that, and we'll go into a little bit more depth on that in a couple of slides. These are some general guidelines for your testing frequency. These are partially my suggestions, partially from USP or other standards. Make sure that you look at your state rules, that you look at USP, that you look at maybe if you're PCAB accredited, what the requirements are there. You want to make sure all your bases are covered, okay? Specific to you and your pharmacy and whatever accreditations and licenses that you have. First up, potency. I would suggest the most common formulas be tested once every 6 months. You need to decide on what's going to be best for you. Not performing any potency testing is not an option. You need to have at least some objective data that your people, your processes, and your formulas are going to produce a quality compounded preparation. And that happens through potency testing. Make sure that whatever you decide, that it's not zero. Competency assessments, these need to happen upon hire and annually thereafter, semi-annually if you're sterile performing high-risk compounding. Observations, those need to be completed upon training, annually thereafter, semi-annually for sterile. The competency and observations, those are very important to happen immediately after the training is completed, so you have, again, objective evidence that that new individual is qualified to be performing compounding on their own. Your clean room certifications, those need to happen semi-annually, or if there's any type of major change to the facilities or the equipment. Your powder containment hoods need to be certified annually and whenever they're moved, semi-annually for sterile. And your balance calibrations. This should happen initially when they're new, annually thereafter, and whenever they're moved. And in this case, I'm talking about the third-party annual calibration. You might have a different frequency. That's fine. Just make sure that you know what that is, because that's going to help us create that training program down the line. When we start thinking about what we want to test, there's a couple of ways we can do this. We can look at our data, and we can also use risk-based decision making. So when you're deciding on what to test, this is helpful because higher risk preparations should be given a priority. So as we decide, in this case, potency, right? We can't test everything. That's too expensive, and it doesn't make sense for a compounder to test potency on everything. So let's use some risk-based decision making. When you're thinking about sterile versus non-sterile, your sterile has a higher risk, right? Now, when you go into sterile, the different dosage forms are going to have different risk. One might be more risky than the other. Compare an ophthalmic with an intrathecal injection. Which one is more risky? You can also think about API with a narrow therapeutic index. So in the past, the pharmacy I worked at, we made a pain medication that was injectable. It was dosed in micrograms. If that dosing was off, it could potentially kill someone. So it didn't matter what size our batch was. For that specific preparation, we tested potency every time, whether it was 10 vials or 50 vials. We always tested potency because the risk of that potency being out of spec and getting to a customer was too great. On the non-sterile side, you can look at low concentration preparations. So think anything dosed in milligrams or micrograms. It's a lot easier to make a 100 milligram capsule than it is to make a 1 milligram capsule. So look at those lower concentrations. Multi-ingredient preparations are good to look at. And then here again, any API with a narrow therapeutic index you might want to get on your testing schedule. The second part of this is using the data that you have. So if you can run a report from your compounding software, pick a specific time frame that's going to give you an accurate example of what you make most frequently. So that might be 6 months of data, it might be a year, maybe it's 3 months of data. Whatever is going to work for you that you believe will show you all the preparations that you make frequently. You want to sort that data by the number of units to see what you make the most. We're not necessarily focusing on how much does it cost. We want to see the highest quantity. You might have a preparation that's made with an API that's very expensive. And if you sort it by cost, that's going to show up at the top. But if you only made it twice in a year, would it make sense to send that for potency testing? Probably not. So for this, we're going to go ahead and look at quantity and not cost. Chances are when you sort this data out that 80% of your revenue is going to come from 20% of your formulas. What you want to do is you want to focus on getting those 20% tested regularly. So those are the ones that are going to go on your testing schedule. Let's go ahead and take a look at an example of that. So here's our example data. Don't look at it too closely. It's probably not going to make much sense. I just made it up for the purposes of giving you an example. But here we have it sorted by quantity. So you can see our highest quantity preparations are up there at the top. There's 35 formulas listed here, and those top 7, which is 20%, are accounting for 72.3% of our imaginary revenue in this example. Now, it's not quite 80-20. It doesn't exactly fit the 80-20 rule. But what we're seeing here is that a smaller percentage of formulas is resulting in the larger percentage of revenue. So we say, all right, we've got these top 7. These are accounting for most of our revenue. These 100% need to be on our testing schedule. And then maybe we look at the quantity and we see, okay, well, there's several more after that that are a pretty high quantity. And I think since we're making so much of that, I want to include it. So I'm going to say that everything over 1,500 units is going to end up on my testing program. So now I'm testing 15 out of 35 formulas. Okay. Some of those towards the bottom, maybe they might be more expensive or might generate more revenue. But if we make them once or twice, it doesn't really make sense for that to be on the testing program. This 80-20 rule, it's not going to be perfect. If you sort your data like this, it's probably not going to exactly split to where 80% of your revenue is coming from 20% of your formulas. But I think that you get the idea of what we're going for here and how we're going to use this to help us choose what needs to be in our testing program. The preparation potency testing is incredibly important for your compounding technicians. This needs to happen initially during their training. So they get hired on, they start their training, they do some competency assessments. Once that training and those competency assessments are done, they have an observation where they're being watched by someone who is skilled and qualified to make sure that they're following their process. Send that preparation out for potency testing. That's going to give you completely objective data that that technician is qualified to compound that dosage form. So if you've got a tech and all they do is make capsules, send out capsules. If they're going to be making multiple different dosage forms, I would highly suggest that you have them send a sample of each different type of dosage form so you have them qualified to make that dosage form. And then semi-annually after that, if you can swing it, you want them to send out that samples for testing. You can align your technician potency testing with the data from your compounding software. So in our example, in the previous slide, we had those 15 preparations. Maybe I've got 5 technicians. I can assign 3 preparations to each one of my technicians. 2 birds with 1 stone, right? Have some of your tests scheduled so the technician knows what I'm making right now is going to go out for testing. And if you can, have some of your tests that are pulled at random. So if you do anticipatory compounding and you're making a larger batch, see if you can take some of that, quarantine the batch. Of course, we'll talk about that in the next slide, and send that out for testing. If someone knows they're going to be evaluated, they're going to try extra hard for it to be perfect, right? If you pull a sample and they don't know it's going to be tested, that's going to be more evidence of how in control your processes and your people are. I mentioned quarantine. Your testing should be performed on representative samples. If your batch is normally made as 800 grams, don't have your technician make a 10-gram sample and send it for testing. It's not going to accurately reflect the normal process. I mentioned this a couple times, but your potency testing is assessing your technician, your formula, and your process, right? So if it's 800 grams and that's what you normally do, have them make that, send off 5, 10 grams, whatever it is that needs to be sent for testing, quarantine the rest of it until you get your results. You want your testing to be an accurate reflection of the processes you normally follow. You normally make a batch of 300 capsules. Don't have the technician make 30 capsules. Have them make 300 and just quarantine the batch until their results come back. When you're testing a sample from a larger batch size, the rest of the sample has to go into quarantine. You don't want to risk having a recall, so just put it in quarantine until those results come back. Quarantine can be a locked cabinet. It could be a cage. It could be an entire room, just depending on your resources. Make sure that it is limited access, so only certain people are able to get into quarantine. And you want to do that because you want to make sure that something that's quarantined doesn't accidentally get dispensed. You can use a quarantine form to document the movement of materials into quarantine, your test results review, and your final approval or rejection. If you've got a quality department, they can do this, but just make sure as a 503A compounding pharmacy that you don't forget the pharmacist's signature as well. Here is an example of a quarantine form. This has been provided to you as a download. It's in a Word format, so you can edit it, so you can make it your own. If you want to adopt this or incorporate it into your existing SOPs, just make sure that you make it your own. Don't just slap your name on it and use it. You want to make sure that it fits your pharmacy and that you have an SOP that goes along with it to explain how it's used and how it's completed. In this example here, we've got a quarantine form for progesterone 100 milligram capsules. We've got our PUD, our lot number, and our quantity for quarantine. It's 890 capsules. Our reason for quarantine listed is potency testing. And then there's some comments here. In this case, it says, scheduled tech sample goes with annual observation for technician J. Smith. So in this case, we are using this batch made to validate our technician. We've listed our lab and our quantity for testing. And then we have a few different tests that we perform frequently listed on this form: potency, pH, sterility, container closure integrity, endotoxin, and method suitability. If you're not a sterile pharmacy, those last 4 probably not going to be for you. Again, this is a Word document, so you can edit it and put in the testing that you most frequently send out, so this form makes sense for your pharmacy. Then there's a section for the person to submit the form to sign, and then for the person who is putting the item into quarantine to sign. In this case, it's a quality technician. Again, if you don't have a quality department, that's totally fine. Just make sure you edit the form so that it matches up. The next section is material disposition. So this is where we're saying, what are we doing with this material? Is it going to be approved or rejected? The material disposition choices are approved, release for use, rejected, destroy, return to manufacturer, and other. I've added return to manufacturer because perhaps you do testing on your API. If you have some strange results with your API testing, you would want to return that to the manufacturer. In this case, it was marked as approved. The QA comments say potency results are 98.7%. See attached. We want to include the potency results. And then we've got a pharmacist approval and quality approval. Again, change that if you don't have a quality department to whatever is going to work for you. At a very minimum, you need that pharmacist approval signature. This is going to help us keep track of what was in quarantine, what was sent out for testing, and if it was approved or rejected. If something is rejected, please make sure that you have documentation that it was destroyed and not dispensed. Our test results need to have a documented review. So for the preparations that were sent out for testing and we use the quarantine form, that review is documented on the quarantine form. I want you to think about how you're going to document the review of other types of testing. So your clean room gets certified and you get your clean room certification report back. How are you documenting that that was reviewed and approved? It might be as simple as just printing it out and handwriting the signature at the end. Maybe you're going to create a form, who knows, but make sure that you thought about that and that you are documenting the review and approval of whatever type of third-party testing you're having completed, from your powder hood certifications to your clean room certifications. Make sure that your procedure lists who will review the testing and how it'll be documented, and that you're retaining that documentation according to your record-keeping procedures. Now, we've got all this data. We should definitely trend it. It can demonstrate the skill of your technicians, and it's also going to help you understand which formulas and processes are performing consistently. It can inform you if a specific formula or process needs to be reevaluated. So maybe if during your potency testing program, you're seeing that a certain formula is always low, it's always 92%, and it should be 100, right? We're always aiming for 100. But you've got results from several different technicians, and it's always coming back super low, almost outside your plus or minus 10% window. You would want to investigate and say, why is that happening? Why is this trending so low? Is it a process issue? Is it a formula issue, right? It might not be a technician issue because we've got results from several different technicians. There's a lot your data can tell you once you start collecting it and trending it. Another thing you could do is to create technician report cards. So this is a great way to reward skillful technicians. A carrot is always better than a stick. It could also help encourage some healthy competition in your pharmacy. I've done this before in my past. It was a lot of fun. It helped the technicians that were trying really hard to do a great job to feel recognized. So that is an option for you.
There is a lot to consider when designing a testing program between the different types of testing and the required frequency. Who do you recommend should create the program?
Yeah, so I would look for somebody on your staff that's very thorough and that's good with using Excel. I'm sure there's other ways that you can sort through the data. For me, I just like to use Excel because I find it to be the easiest method. But chances are you've got somebody on your staff that's good with that kind of thing, that can download the data and go through that, sort it out, go through some of the steps we talked about in the presentation. It could be a pharmacist, it could be a technician, anybody that's very thorough and detail-oriented would be good.
I was going to say, this sounds like it might be a good opportunity for a technician who's maybe looking to increase their responsibilities.
Yeah, yep, absolutely.
So any technicians out there, take note.
Yes.
You talked a little bit about risk-based decision-making. Can you give another example of that?
Sure. So we talked about in the presentation sterile versus non-sterile, and that's really obvious, right? Sterile is a greater risk to patient safety. But you can also think about how difficult something is to compound. So you might have a non-sterile preparation that has very specific mixing instructions. Things need to go in a certain order, or you need to use various different types of equipment, or it takes a very long time to make, something like that is going to pose a higher risk as opposed to mixing two commercially available creams together, which is really easy. So you want to look at, risk to the patient, safety, sterile versus non-sterile, and also the risk to the preparation quality. If you have a more complicated process, that's going to pose a little bit more of a risk than if it's simple.
Okay, thanks. What should someone do if their preparation data does not fit the 80-20 rule?
Yeah, so the 80-20 rule is really just to kind of give you a place to start. The data is probably not ever going to come out that clean where it's exactly 80-20. Really want to be focusing on is what are your preparations that are going to have the largest impact to your patient population. If you make one cream that goes to one person, that's low risk because it's impacting one person. If you do some anticipatory compounding, you make a larger batch of capsules and it's going to go to 30 different patients, that's going to be a higher risk because now you're affecting 30 different people. So that's why I encourage everyone to try to look at their data as 80-20 and see what's showing up at the top of that data set, because those are the preparations that are going to be affecting the greatest number of patients and therefore potentially pose a higher risk if they're not good quality.
Okay, thanks.
I mentioned out of specification results. Those have got to be investigated. You cannot get OS results and stick them in a file and call it the end. You have to investigate those results. So you can't really have a testing program without an investigation procedure that goes along with it, because no matter how good you are, something at some point is going to come back out of specification, and it is very important for you to understand, how do I address that, and how do I investigate it and correct it and make sure all of my documentation is thoroughly completed. When you start your investigation, focus on the process, not the people. It's very easy to start pointing fingers, but that really doesn't help anyone. It just gets people feeling very defensive and less likely to cooperate, and that is not what you want. Now, if you go through a whole investigation and it does lead back to a person who's maybe intentionally making an error, that's a different story. But for the most part, when you investigate it, you're going to find that it's a problem with the process. So maybe the training wasn't thorough enough and they didn't understand, or maybe a piece of equipment isn't working properly. Okay, looking at people should really be the last step there. Make sure that you ask for a copy of the testing lab's internal investigation. So whatever lab does your testing, if they get an OS result, you can ask them to retest. Sometimes that'll help them discover, that they've made an error. Or you can ask them to provide you with their own internal investigation report. Don't test into compliance. You might think, all right, I'm just going to get a second lab to test this, and it's going to be fine. You can't do that. Okay. If you have a second lab, test it. That's fine. Just make sure that you notate that it's for investigational and informational purposes only. The batch should never be released unless the original lab found an error that was formally identified, and that was the reason for the OS. So if that original lab that said OS results, they do an investigation internally and they realize it was their error and they retest it and it was passing, that's okay. That can be released. If you have a second lab try to invalidate the first lab's results, that's called testing into compliance, and we really don't want to do it. It's not a good practice, okay? The second lab test should really just be maybe part of your investigation when trying to figure out where things went wrong or why you have that OS. You want to document your investigation. So we're going to have a little review of the investigation report template. I provided that for you as well. It's also a Word document, so you can edit that. We'll look at that on the next slide. And then you want to take action. So once your root cause is known, you need to take action to correct the issue. I have CAPA listed here, which is corrective and preventive action. What are you going to do to immediately correct the problem? And then what are you going to do to prevent it from occurring in the future? Document and collect your objective supporting evidence. Document and collect your objective evidence that you corrected whatever the root cause was. And then make sure you're scheduling a time to verify that your CAPA was effective. So maybe you change something about the process. Schedule a time, a couple months, however long that makes sense for you in the future, where you're going to go back and you're going to verify, was that effective? If you're not verifying the effectiveness of your corrective action, you're missing a whole chunk of it, right? The corrective action doesn't really mean anything if it wasn't effective. So please make sure you're doing that. And then you want to document the destruction of your OOS material. Again, I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that doesn't accidentally get dispensed to any customers. This is a look at what the investigation report template looks like. This is written specifically for non-sterile preparations. You could create another one for sterile preparations. Like I said, this is a Word document, so you can edit it however you like, however it makes sense for you. This is not the only way to perform an investigation. It's just the way I personally like to do it. The moral of the story here is, whether you use this or not, as long as you're documenting it, that is the most important thing. In this case, we've got a section at the top where we complete all the information about our preparation that we're investigating. We're going to check off what documents we reviewed during our investigation. And then all those little checkboxes there in the middle, those are our investigation elements. So those are all the things we're specifically asking about this preparation during our investigation. And we're going to answer yes, no, or NA to these questions. The first section is about our batch record. So were the calculations correct? Were the ingredient quantities correct? Were the ingredients correct? Were there salt or water adjustments that were accurately applied? That sort of thing. Next, we go into equipment. Equipment can sometimes end up being the root cause of an issue, so it's important you're taking a look at that equipment. Was it calibrated? Was it used properly? Your lab results. Did the lab find an error on their side? And then your compounding tech. Make sure you talk to them. Have a little interview. Sit down with them and say, hey, we got this result. Did you notice anything weird going on? Did something distract you? Did you make a mistake? They might or might not remember, depending on how long ago it was, but it's important to sit down with them and just talk to them and see if you can uncover the root cause that way. There's a section here for comments and a little checkbox to say that you have attached your objective evidence. So your test results, batch record, anything else that you've collected that is going to help support your determined root cause. The second page has our results. This is where you would list a description of your most likely cause or your root cause, depending on if you can pin it down completely. You would list your element number from page 1, describe your potential root cause, and then who's responsible. The last column says CAR number. That stands for Corrective Action Report. So again, we mentioned if you identify a root cause, you need to have some sort of corrective action and you need to document it. So this is going to tie that investigation to your corrective action. There's a place for the person who completed the investigation to sign a date. This goes to quality, who reviews it, assigns a corrective action number, and then also a signature spot for the pharmacist in charge approval. Now, this can be changed depending on the structure, how your teams are, what kind of departments you have, how you would perform an investigation. If this is too much, that's fine. Scale it back. If it's not enough, make it better. If you have a form that you currently use, that's awesome. Like I said, the main thing is that if you get an OS result, you are documenting the investigation and you are documenting your corrective action. All right, let's do a little quick review. I know that was kind of a lot of information really fast. All right, we want to create a basic testing frequency matrix. It's a good idea for you to perform this every year in January or even December for the next year, and then use your data to decide which preparations need testing. From this information, you'll write your testing program. We'll look at an example on the next slide. You're going to base this on your frequency matrix and your data, include dates, and assign the testing to the responsible party. Make this a formal document. That way, it holds you accountable to make sure you're getting that testing done and it's staying on track. Then, use all of this wonderful objective data as evidence of your superb quality. All right, this is a little small. Hopefully, you'll be able to see it better on the downloaded slides. This first picture here, that is how I created this example testing program. I just went in and for the testing type, I put what is all the testing we need to do. The second column is frequency. So the first one is our clean rooms. Those need to be done semi-annually. So it says clean room, semi-annual, and then under the description, it says 1 and 2, right? Because it happens every 6 months. Competency assessments, we've got media fills, 797 and 795 written tests. We have the second media fill, because we want to do that semi-annually if we're doing high-risk compounding. We've got our equipment, calibrations, and certifications. Observations that we want to do annually for our non-sterile compounding technicians. I've got listed in here some pharmacist observations. And then potency testing. So this is where we would list all those formulas that we decided to put into our testing program based on our evaluation of our data that we did. And then in the notes column, I've included the technician that preparation's been assigned to. You can create this however you like. This just made sense to me, but you can create whatever columns make sense for you. Assign a due date. Once that's completed, you'll sort it out to where it goes from the beginning of the year to the end. So when you start the year in January, you've got this list sorted out in date order, and you know what you need to do and when you need to do it. This is going to help you keep track of what testing is required, when it needs to happen, to make sure that your testing is not overdue or that doesn't get completely missed, which can sometimes happen in a busy pharmacy. You can also add some columns for your test results, when they were reviewed, how they were reviewed, whatever you want to do that's going to help you keep this information organized and keep you on track. That's really the main thing here, is that you've got something put together that's going to keep you on track and accountable for what you determined you needed to test in your pharmacy. Now that we've gotten through that and we've gone through some examples, we're going to go through our ACPE questions. So I hope you're ready for a little quiz.
Next. When sending out samples for potency testing, do you always have to quarantine any remaining preparation from the batch being tested?
Technically, you don't have to do that as long as you have a recall procedure in place. I personally always encourage you to do that because the risk, of course, is that if you send it out for testing and you've already dispensed it and it comes back out of specification, you're going to end up having to perform a recall, which is a huge bummer. Nobody wants to have to do that. So I like to err on the side of caution and just quarantine the remainder of that batch until my results come back. And then once I know everything, it can be dispensed to patients.
Okay, thanks. Who should review the OOS results and begin the investigation?
If you have a quality department, this would be a great job for them, as long as they are trained and qualified so they know what they're looking at when those results come in. Of course, as a pharmacy, you want to make sure you've got a pharmacist signing off on all of that as well. But that initial work can absolutely be done by a technician in the quality department. If you don't have a quality department, you want to look for pretty much the same thing, an individual that you can train so that they understand the results that they're looking at and they understand the procedure that they need to go through for an investigation. So they can get that started and then hand it off to a pharmacist for a final check and review.
Okay. One of the things that I recently was talking to somebody about is sometimes, and this could be a completely irrelevant question, just it made me think of it, is the push and pull between quality and the manufacturing side. Like sometimes when quality sees something, they have to flag, stop. And then, of course, the manufacturing profit side is like, no, we can't do that. Does that ever come up when it comes to these types of testing program? And if so, how do you have any thoughts on navigating that?
Yeah, it absolutely can come up because if you've got something in quarantine and maybe testing is delayed because the lab has an issue and they want to retest to make sure the results are correct, that would delay your ability to get that preparation released from quarantine. And you maybe have patients waiting for that. And it's going to happen every now and again, no matter how well you plan. but planning is the key. So if you've got sterile preparations, you know those have to be tested. You know it's going to take X number of days for sterility testing, whether you're doing rapid or compendial, and you need to kind of build that into your plan. So on the operations side, consider the amount of time the testing is going to take, put in a couple of buffer days, and plan based on that. That way, if there is an issue or delay, you've already built that extra time into your schedule, and it won't affect your ability to get preparations to patients. Like I said, though, it's probably going to happen. So that's where you want to try to be flexible and think about what are alternatives we have. Can we make a new batch? If something is maybe looking like it's going to have to go into investigation, let's automatically start a new one and get that sent out to try to minimize the impact that it could have on your patients.
Okay, great. Thanks. Great advice. Just out of curiosity, do you see that push and pull yourself? Like, have you been involved in, are the people kind of, do they get mad and be like, no, we have to keep going. You're messing with the schedule.
Yeah, there is absolutely a push and pull in quality and operations. It's always kind of like this sort of battle, and I'll joke with my operations managers about it, but really you're an absolute team. You cannot function without each other. It's just essential that you work together. And when those challenges come up, you know, from the quality side, I say, no, we can't release this. We have to fully investigate. And operations is thinking about, yeah, there's dollars and money, but also the patient needs their medication. And I can see that side too.
Yeah.
So you just have to work through it as a team and realize that at the end of the day, you're both here for the patient that's on the other side.
Right. Good point. Good point. Okay, that concludes my questions for this session. Thank you.
All right, question 1. Which of the following tests are acceptable to perform in-house? Sterility, potency, pH, or powder hood certification? So which one of those tests listed do you think is appropriate to perform in-house? Now, keep in mind, I'm not asking which one is possible to perform in-house, but which one is appropriate to perform in-house. If you were thinking option C, pH, you are correct. pH is very commonly performed in-house. In fact, it has to be when you're adjusting the pH of any formula. Question 2. When reviewing formula data, 80% of your revenue will likely come from blank percent of your formulas. These formulas should be included in your testing program. All right, so which formulas from that data need to be included? 20%, 10%, 50%, or 80%? If you selected A, 20%, you are correct. This is from the 80-20 rule. I mentioned it's probably not going to be perfect when you look at your data, but it gives you an idea of the most critical formulas that need to be tested in your pharmacy. All right, question 3. An investigation into out-of-specification potency results does not include which of the following? Okay, it does not include which of the following? Review of the lab results and lab-conducted investigation, review of the compounding records, interview with a compounding technician, review of pharmacy's most recent regulatory inspection. All right, remember, I underlined it. We're asking which of these is not included in an OOS investigation. If you selected D, review of pharmacy's most recent regulatory inspection, you are correct. Thank you very much for hanging out for designing a testing program. I really hope that you got some valuable information out of this lesson, that you got some tools that you can use and implement in your pharmacy right away. If you have any questions for me or you just want to say hi, you can find me on LinkedIn. I've got the URL listed there, as well as my email. Thank you so much for hanging out with me while we talked about designing a testing program. I hope you have a wonderful day and happy testing.
Thank you for watching. Remember, if you would like ACPE credit for this lecture, click on the link below and register for the class. You won't have to watch the video again, just answer the quiz questions. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you can be updated on all our latest content.